In a total war, civilian lives are under threat from starvation, shell fire, advancing armies, and aerial bombardment. Civilians are often targeted by the enemy because they are mobilized in order to contribute to the war effort. But there may also be civilians who work against the war or against their own country. And the fear of that possibility led to decisions in Allied nations to intern potential fifth columnists. The idea of a fifth column, enemy supporters working within a nation's borders, emerged in the Spanish Civil War. General Mola, commanding 4 nationalist columns advancing on Madrid, boasted that he had a fifth column working inside the city. But civilians as potential internal enemy predated that conflict. One way in which the government sought to reduce the risk of fifth columnists was by rounding up those deemed to be enemy aliens. The International Red Cross estimates that during the First World War, 2 million civilians were interned in camps for several years. Most of those interned were living in nations at war with the countries of their birth.
During wartime, it's a recognised convention of war that when you have civilian enemy aliens, so they're individuals who were born in the nation that you're at war with, that you can intern them, and it's up to the country to decide the rules of internment. I think where it becomes more applicable to the total war idea is where you actually have this idea that because somebody looks different, they can actually be interned regardless of their citizenship. And so that's taking the idea of national security and total war and then moving it into an area that is completely inappropriate.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, 70,000 Germans and Austrians living in the UK became enemy aliens. They became subject to a classification system.
They set up a series of tribunals where enemy aliens would go before a magistrate and a court, and they would have their classification. So if they were deemed to be an immediate threat, then they would be given a classification of A and immediately interned. If the magistrate wasn't sure, or they just didn't like foreigners, they'd give them a classification of B, where they were still at liberty, but they had to register with the police and they were under a curfew. And if they were deemed C, that meant that there is a classification of a genuine refugee, and so potentially they could remain at liberty.
But the application of the classification system was not always consistent, which sometimes led to arbitrary decisions.
There was a big difference in classification, so it was sort of very much a postcode lottery in the sense that you could live in different parts of the country and present the same evidence but come out with a different classification. Some of the magistrates believed that if an individual could speak English fluently, then they were more likely to be trustworthy, whereas if someone couldn't speak English at all, they are more likely to be a spy, which is an interesting set of logic.
Most were classed as Category C and were not subject to internment or restrictions. But in 1940, the fear of invasion saw increasing numbers of Germans and Austrians living in southern England being interned. When Italy joined the war, Italian residents in Britain were also interned. This included some who were members of the Fascist Party. But all those aged between 16 and 70 who had lived in Britain less than 20 years could potentially be sent to the internment camps scattered across the UK, the largest of them being on the Isle of Man. Internment was particularly difficult for women and children.
In terms of women, it was less pleasant for them because they often ended up being taken to Holloway Prison, so they were treated much more like criminals. Initially, the women would be separated from their children, so some children were taken into care, and then they would be reunited later on with their mothers on the Isle of Man.
As numbers increased, thousands of internees were also deported overseas to Canada and Australia.